morning, everyone. So welcome to the day after the budget. So look, pleased to have a growing list joining us, and I'm sure there'll be others coming online in the minutes ahead. So this is the post-budget member briefing that we've organised today for ACCI members. If I can just ask you, if you're online, please to mute your microphones. We've got a little bit of background noise coming through, so it'll make it easier, I think, for everybody. So thank you so much for that. Now, look, we wanted to take the opportunity, I think, to get moving as quickly as possible. Last night, you will have seen the ACCI team did a tremendous job analysing the budget. We had a team in the lockup along with many others analysing the budget, and there was a brief, a very comprehensive brief sent out late yesterday evening. So hopefully many of you have received that, and that has been helpful in terms of providing your own information and briefing to your members, to your companies, and so on. But look, I certainly give a shout out to all members of the ACCI team who were involved in preparing that briefing last night, because the team worked extremely hard. What we want to do today is provide a bit of an overview of the budget context, some of the key parameters. In a moment, I'll ask David Alexander, our Chief of Policy and Advocacy, to give us a bit of a context around the broader, dynamics supporting the budget. We'll ask Peter Grist, who is our principal economist, to provide a run through on some of the important elements from an economic and policy standpoint. We have on standby the relevant portfolio specialists, and they can talk us through any key portfolio announcements, but of course many of you will be across those in any event. We want to open it up for discussion, so there'll be different views about different aspects, and I think this can be a two-way process, so let's get that going. Firstly, in overview from my point of view, I think we were probably a little chastened in terms of what we saw in the budget as we started to absorb the detail. The first and very good thing, of course, is that the government is projecting to achieve a budget surplus, second successive budget surplus in the current financial year. So that's a good thing. And I think that means that at least for this year, fiscal policy and monetary policy have been pushing in the same direction. The outlook over the medium term is a little more concerning, and what we saw as we analysed the figures last night is a situation. Sorry, Brooke, can I just ask you to mute if possible?
Sorry, I thought I muted.
No problem. That's okay.
Apologies.
What we saw is an outlook where there's increased spending. There are increased deficits over the medium term compared to what was projected in December, and increased net debt. In those circumstances, it's hard to accept the narrative that the budget itself is taking inflationary pressure out of the economy. Sure, some of the measures will detract from the headline CPI. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of underlying inflation, which is what the Reserve Bank will fundamentally look at when it's judging the timing of the next move on interest rates, which we hope is down, then obviously they'll be looking at those core inflationary pressures. And we didn't see something where this budget is giving the Reserve Bank any new reason to begin reducing interest rates more rapidly. And for us, that is one of the most fundamental ways that the budget can contribute to taking the pressure off cost of living and the cost of doing business. In terms of policy priorities, very quick comment. I mean, in terms of things like small business, there are some slim pickings there, as we said. There are a couple of measures, obviously the renewal of the energy bill relief, the renewal of the instant asset write-off, which for last year was only legislated yesterday, so better late than never. we really do think that's got to be put on a longer term footing. We'd like it to be more generous, but at least that's continuing. So there's some, I think, measures there for small business, and that's something. Skills and training, there's a lot of detail to absorb. The one thing we were focusing on a little bit last night is what's happening with apprenticeship incentives. We've seen that that's stepped down again from where it is currently, so at least it's not falling off a complete cliff. We have the strategic review underway, which Justice Ian Ross and Lisa Paul are conducting. Obviously, we think that's important. It's a kind of breathing space, perhaps a bit sort of constrained breathing space, but that's something. Future Made in Australia, broadly, I think this is a good initiative, but here we interpret what's been published as being a couple of things. I mean, I think we could say it's a $5 each way bet. They might be picking winners. I think the situation here is if the winners they're picking win, the costs actually won't be that great. 22.7 billion projected in the budget over 10 years. I don't think that really touches the sides, but equally the risks to the economy more broadly from such a limited strategy, when you consider that the US Inflation Reduction Act is $800 billion US to $1 trillion US, it's a whole different order of magnitude. So overall, I think not a lot to be excited about from a business point of view. The one thing I agree with Jim Chalmers on this morning, I heard him saying that this is a budget which is about relief, restraint, and reform in equal parts. Well, I think I agree with that, Jim. I think it's limited relief, little restraint, and very negligible reform. So sadly, I think that's probably the overall assessment for us. But enough from me. What I'm going to do at this point is bring David Alexander in. So David, perhaps you'll have some further insights. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes. So as we looked at the budget, we did think that it was quite a lackluster effort. And I'll just go through some of the key parameters that will outline how we've come to that conclusion. Peter, if you want to move to the next slide. So on the top line, you can see GDP growth. It's going to continue to be subdued over the forward estimates. Quite disappointing. We're in a bit of a boiling frog situation where people are getting accustomed to these low levels. It shouldn't necessarily be the case. Unemployment rate scheduled to tick up a bit. Again, that's consistent with a weaker economy. The CPI, inflation, that's a core point of focus at the moment, naturally enough, because the Reserve Bank is sitting there on a hair trigger, ready to potentially put interest rates up. Last week, the Reserve Bank governor said that they had discussed whether they should put rates up. They didn't, but clearly that's part of their thinking. And what stands out is that by the end of this year, you can see inflation CPI forecast to come down to 2.75. So the government's pegging quite a bit of its reputation on that CPI figure coming down. Part of that is a mechanical result of providing energy bill relief and other measures, and partly weaker economy. So ultimately, the judge of that will be the Reserve Bank itself. So there'll be all eyes on that. But we do think that the sheer volume of new spending that's coming into the economy will, in and of itself, put pressure on inflation. The wage price index, you can see it at 4% right now. That's easing off. Again, I don't know how much confidence that Treasury will have in those estimates. And then the next line is business investment, which you can see currently 5.5%, but that's dropping off to very low rates of 1% and 2%. And that reflects a concern that we've had that underlying confidence of business in investing is really quite low. And providing various trinkets and baubles of policies of one sort or another is not going to cut it, because businesses want a broad-based underpinning of good indicators. And the final line there, net overseas migration, you will have noted, is coming back dramatically from dramatically high peaks, but nevertheless, it's been a wild ride for business trying to anticipate the migration levels. And you can see some sectors, like education, are really bearing the brunt of that discontinuity. Let's go to the next slide, Peter. Yeah, so a few key points in working out what's really going on here. Spending is up. This is a key theme of the government. It's up 4.5% this year. I think it's 3.6% next year. And they're really hitting a new structural level of around 26% of GDP over the forward estimates. And Peter, if you just want to go to the next slide, I think this graph really tells the story. And I always think it's one of the best graphs in the budget, because it tells where we've been to and where we are, and a bit of where we're going to. But what you can really see with the blue line is that spending result. And you can just see from here on, there's a structurally higher level of spending. It's a structural step up compared to the last 20 years. Of course, there's volatility, variability, but this is a policy shift from the government. Along with that, you can see the receipts, i.e. the tax levels, also going a step up. And so this is quite a significant shift for the economy. It's quite deliberate from the government, but it is a change. Notwithstanding those tax levels going up to a structurally higher level, they're not meeting the payments levels, and that's why there's deficits predicted over the next decade. Of course, it meets at the end. Who knows? The further out the estimates get, the less reliable they are. But you can see there a higher taxing, higher spending government. Just go back for a minute, Peter. Yeah, so that large spend will put pressure on inflation for this immediate term. The large spend is also going to increase pressure for higher taxes. There's deficits projected, and already there was a suggestion on the ABC last night that Stephen Kennedy was talking yesterday in the lockup about the need for higher taxes to wind in the deficit. So there's already been some pressure about that, but the prospects of lower taxes are really receding, any meaningfully lower taxes. If anything, there's, within the government, I think they will use that as a pretext for higher taxes. I've put the figures in there for taxes up 6.2% this year. And so we're looking at deficits of around 1% of GDP over the forward estimates. And I couldn't help but notice that the Treasurer has introduced a new term called unavoidable spending, really a bit of a gloss on what is ultimately up to the government. It's avoidable if they choose to do it. Net debt is higher over the entire projection period, not by a huge amount, but it's up over that period. Part of all of this does reflect a significant decision that they took on coming to government, which was not to have any fiscal rules. So there were fiscal rules applied from 1996 onwards, and all governments have been putting it in there, basically to achieve a budget balance over the economic cycle. So it's not a hard, arithmetic rule, but it is a very high level of discipline. And they've also exempted themselves from any sort of tax cap. So the coalition had a tax cap self-imposed of 23.9% of GDP. Most Labor governments have come into office saying that they would not have tax higher than the pre-existing government. But this government gave itself permission from the beginning to really do what they wanted without breaking any rules. Another thing I'll mention is there is a table of truth, what's called the table of truth in the budget. And it just separates out what are the impact of government decisions on the budget versus what are the impacts of external factors, acts of God, energy prices caused by Ukraine or whatever. So what it shows is that budget repair has really been due to external factors. The actual decisions that governments have taken have been impairing the budget. So Chris Richardson says that next year's budget is predicted to be a deficit of 28 billion. If the government had done nothing, taken no decisions since the election, that deficit would be 9 billion. So there's some significant decisions there. And the final thing I'll say is that there's really no significant productivity measures, no real economic reform. So I don't think the speed limit of this economy is going to be increased through anything in the budget. They're really just looking at spending as being their solution. And with that, I'll hand over now to our principal economist, Peter Grist.
Okay, so I'll just go through some of the key policy announcements, so a bit of an overview of those. So the centrepiece of the budget is the Future Made in Australia package, and that brings together a number of programs, many of them that have already been announced, but the focus is very much on the net zero transformation and building manufacturing and resources capacity and evaluating in Australia. As David was saying, in terms of the Future Made in Australia package, the jury is still very much out whether this is going to support longer-term productivity growth. If it's just a matter of picking winners, there may be some that actually provide benefits to productivity, but they may be choosing some and supporting some that probably would have gone ahead anyway, or they may be supporting some that will, over the long term, continually require government support and will never really be competitive. So the government's walking a pretty fine line with it. The Future Made in Australia itself involves legislating the Future Made in Australia Act and also the National Interest Framework. A key component of the Future Made in Australia is the creation of a new front door for investors. And this is a single contact point for investors with major investment portfolios. And it's aiming to streamline engagement with the government and help them to navigate approval processes and fast track major projects where possible. So overall, the government's investing 22 billion over the next decade, and there are a number of programs that's the programs that are on budget, but there are also a number of programs that are off budget, so they're investment facilities which don't actually show up in the bottom line. Some of the key initiatives recently announced are the Capacity Investment Scheme, and that's 65 billion over the next decade. There's the Solar Sunshot program, the Psi Quantum partnership with Queensland and Psi Quantum, the Hydrogen Head Start program. There's also a number of new measures there, including the hydrogen production tax incentive, which is about $6 billion, critical minerals production incentive, which is another $7 billion, and there's also other investments in Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund and the Renewable Energy Agency. I suppose the government has focused a lot on cost of living relief, and as David was saying, they see the energy bill relief and rental relief as key components to actually drive down inflation. I think, as David said, I think the jury is still out whether these will have a positive or a negative impact on inflation, and we'll have to wait for the Reserve Bank's next meeting to find out whether they agree with the government that it's actually going to bring down inflation. We'll have to wait and see there. There's also the stage 3 tax cuts, which were announced, which provide a benefit for all taxpayers, all 11 million taxpayers, as the government reminds us. For small business, there are pretty slim pickings, as Andrew had mentioned. There's the extension of the instant asset write-off for another year, and overall, they're only budgeting about $290 million for it. So it really won't have a major impact, and the limitations on it are for only $20,000 investment and for businesses with at 10 billion in turnover. So it's really only targeting the smaller businesses. There's also the energy bill relief for small businesses. There's a digital ID system going in to reduce the administrative burden on businesses. That's broader for all businesses, but there is a small business component. And there's also a new access for small businesses program to assist small business startups, and an expansion of the payment times reporting regulatory functions. For skills and migration, there's the Australian Apprenticeship Incentive Scheme, and the revisions to that will see the employer-centred incentives brought forward in the first year with $2,000 in 6 months and $3,000 at 12 months. And while this is a significant decrease on what we've received in the past, based on what was currently in the schedule for the changes on 1st of July 2024, it's actually a $1,000 increase. And the apprenticeship incentive component of that will bring forward a $3,500 incentive in the first year and $1,500 in the second year. And that's actually also a reduction from current the current scheme, but it's actually a $2,000 increase on what was scheduled. There's the Skilling Australia workforce, skilling the clean energy workforce program, and that'll expand energy training capacity and also add more teacher trainers. And another component of it is to promote hydrogen workforce development. There's the boosting skilled workers in the housing and construction sector, and a key part of that is an additional 15,000 free TAFE positions, as well as a pre-apprenticeships program. In terms of let's start again. There's also the work placements for nurses, early childhood and social workers, which provides up to about $8,300 for these workers to do their mandatory their placements in the workplace as part of their training. Permanent migration program, that's been as David showed, the numbers of migration is going to come down to around previous levels of around 260,000. The permanent migration program, they've set the threshold at at 185,000, which is a little bit less than the 190,000 that we'd been asking for. And of that, that includes 132,000 places in the skills stream. And they're also introducing a pre-application ballot process for holiday workers on 462 visas. I'll leave it there and open things for questions.
Thanks very much, Peter. So, and David, for those comments and for the overview. Let's open it for questions and discussion. If you would like to raise a point, please seek to raise your hand virtually. We'll make it easier for us to spot, but certainly welcome if there are any questions. So we have online our portfolio experts. So other than Peter, we've got Jen, Work Health and Safety. We've got Sam McKenna, who covers a range of areas, training and so on, and had a detailed look at that. Tourism, small business, all of those areas. We've got our workplace relations team, our trade team as well. So feel free to ask a question, or if you're interested in making a comment about some of the specific arrangements that relate to you. And I see there was a hand up from Chemistry Australia, so please go ahead.
Hi, Andrew. It's Sam.
Sam, how are you?
Hello. Apologies, my camera has stopped working this morning.
That's okay.
I just have a general question. The business investment is just horrifying. I mean, dropping from 8% down to 1%, I mean, it's just negligible. Do you see anything in the outlook that could turn that around? And are you hearing anything from government about concern? So it just seems extraordinarily low.
So I'll bring, thanks, Sam, an excellent question. And indeed, in the lockup, I can say both Peter and I were looking at those economic projections for business investment. So it certainly caught our eye. Business investment, as we know, has been quite weak for some time. There's nothing really to encourage us in what we're seeing in those forecasts. But I might bring Peter in here. I mean, there are some measures, including in Future Made in Australia, but I'm not sure that we have a high level of confidence that this is really going to turn things around. Peter?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they've placed all their bets on a Future Made in Australia to stimulate investment. They are providing a lot of support for investment. I think there'll be some subsidy components of it, but there's also a lot of financial support in low interest loans and things like that. But most of that is focused on the renewable sector, as well as manufacturing and it's evaluating to resources. So it's sort of they're very focused in that investment. As we mentioned with the instant asset write-off, that is relatively small. We had actually anticipated that there might be a slight increase in the instant asset write-off and an expansion of the threshold. That's what we've been asking for. But when it's focused on just small businesses up to turnover of 10 million, it's a relatively small section of business, and the level of investment is very small as well. So there is, we are very concerned that the rate of decline in business investment, it seems when you look at the forward estimates in 2025, 2024-25, it'll fall to 1% and remain relatively static at that level over the rest of the forward estimates. So it is a significant concern.
Okay, so thanks, Peter and Sam. Hopefully that may not be the answer you wanted to hear, but that's our assessment. So I see Marty Norton, a hand in the air, and you put a question into the chat. So Marty, please go ahead.
Hi, first of all, great overview that you sent out. Thanks very much for that. I wanted to ask a question that I also put in the chat about the cuts for student visa numbers. So noting that that's in the consultation phase, so yet to be seen exactly what happens there. But I'm curious to know how you see that impacting the economy and potentially workforce that might rely on students as well.
Okay, no, that's a super question, and I think it's something we have been talking about quite a bit internally and with a number of members. I think broadly, my impression, yeah, we are concerned. So we are seeing a range of measures, including those points that were announced over the weekend, sort of snuck out over the weekend, which caused concern about. Well, I mean, firstly, we have the level of activity that's occurring at the moment in terms of the extent of student visa approvals. We have the measures applying to the various training providers, which the government is proposing to introduce. I think all of those things give us cause for concern that there is a real clamping of the pipeline. And for us, this is a $40 billion plus export industry. So the idea that we are really closing down this or certainly limiting the growth potential of this very important export industry. And I think the uneven distribution of the impact is a concern as well across the university sector, across the G8 universities, the private universities, and then the vocational education and training providers. So I think that's a starting point, but there's a number of people online who can probably add some perspective to this. We've got Sam McKenna, who's been looking at this. We've got Peter Hendy online. I'm not sure if we have anyone from ITECA, but happy to bring in Peter Hendy or Sam or anyone from ITECA where there's, I think, very close focus on these issues. So anyone wants to jump in on this point, please go ahead. Sam, any perspectives from you on that?
Look, I think you summed it up pretty well. I think obviously there's still a way to go to work this out. I think my understanding is the government wants to implement some of these measures before the 1st or on the 1st of January. So a lot of negotiations and consultations to happen before then to get that in place, given it will be with individual providers. It'll be interesting to see how they intend to tackle that. So we'll keep members updated as we go. But I think Peter Hendy has his hand up as well and can provide some perspective.
Yeah. So Peter, I see your hand up, Peter Hendy.
Yep.
Happy to bring you into the discussion here.
Just to follow up on the initial question, so there obviously is a lot of damage being done to the international education market as a key export industry. There was a lot of speculation before the budget that there might be an additional measure that would constrain the market even more, which is that they were going to increase the student visa application fees. In fact, the rumours were that they were going to double them. When asked that, now that's not in the budget last night, but according to ministers, it is still under very active consideration, and I suspect they may do it. So, and that's an announcement for the future. So that would be another blow to the sector. The other thing just to mention about the budget, and it's probably for the general membership here not a key issue, but we've just spent 2 years doing a major higher education review, which produced a report at the end of last year. The government announced its results, its reaction to the recommendations of that review, and in fact, virtually everything is being put off onto the Never Never. So they're going to create a thing they call the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, but it won't be fully operational till 2026. So most of the reforms that were put forward in the big review may never be introduced or implemented, and most of them that they've already said they will do won't be occurring for a number of years yet, well after the election.
Thanks for that comment, Peter. And indeed, I was looking for that potential visa application fee measure last night. So pleased to see it wasn't in the budget, but we'll see if it sounds like it's still somewhere in the pipeline potentially. So a couple of points. So Mark McKenzie has his hand up. Coming to you, Mark, in a second. There's a few comments and points in the chat, so we'll also seek to get to those. I think, Jen, you were pointing out the R&D review, which I think also flows out of the university's Accord review process with a target to get R&D at least to 2.5%. That's, I think, the minimum objective, but certainly useful to note that that's there. We'll come to the other comments in the chat in a moment, but first, Mark, you've got your hand up. Mark McKenzie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly, go ahead.
Look, just building on, I'm putting my board chair of ITECA hat on, just in relation to the conversation about the student visa stuff. I mean, I really want to take my hat off to you, Andrew, in terms of the comments you made over the weekend, together with our CEO, Troy, in that area around, the damage this is actually going to do to universities. We're certainly hearing outside of the sandstones, and also for the skills area, this is going to be a very significant issue, to the point where most of these enterprises will be putting off staff from the 1st of July. But I think the broader issue here, and a dangerous political narrative that's actually emerged, is the conflation of students and the housing crisis. And I just wonder whether there's an opportunity to attack that a little bit, because clearly, while it's got a very small contribution to it in some of our capital cities and only in those suburbs that are surrounding the universities, the suggestion that it's actually students, the intake of international students that is actually creating the housing crisis is just abhorrent, and probably needs to be called out. But I think there's a broader issue here. If we look about the skilling workforce and what we're trying to do with the green economy, we actually probably need to be making sure that we're actually expanding our pool of students coming into the workforce as we go forward, rather than seeking to contract it. So there's some longer term risk in relation to skills capability in the national workforce that haven't been called out either. So I just wonder whether there's an opportunity, rather than just zeroing in on the budget issue, but certainly not accepting this proposition that the housing crisis is largely due to international students. I just think that that is abhorrent as a proposition and should be called out.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great point, Mark. One I would agree with. I think certainly we have to dig into some of that myth that's being pushed forward in that regard. So I would certainly agree. The influx of international students, that's a very, very small part of the overall housing equation, and a much bigger, I mean, there are other population impacts which are having a much larger impact there in terms of the demand side, and of course the supply side is a huge part of it as well. The government is nowhere near achieving its goals in terms of what they're trying to encourage in housing construction. State government's got a huge role to play there. That's something obviously where we refer a lot to the advice that the HIA provide. But I think it's a fundamental point, and we will certainly be happy to coordinate in how we aim to educate on that particular perspective. So good point. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. There's a number of other comments in the chat. Feel free to put your hand up. We'll keep discussion going for a couple more points. Just looking at what's there. Bronwyn Kapana raised a point around the additional details in terms of Future Made in Australia Act, timelines for its introduction. I think my expectation was that the government would be introducing legislation potentially this week. I'm not sure, Peter, do we have any information on that?
No, I don't have any update on that.
Right. So we'll keep an eye out for that. I think that was the suggestion, that legislation could be introduced this week. We haven't seen it at this point, but certainly we will be happy to share the details of that around the committees as soon as we have that information. I'm not sure, Bronwyn, if that's the key point you were looking for. Thank you. A couple of other points there. So Alana Morris, work health and safety pipeline and SWA reform. Maybe I bring Jen in here. Jen, any quick comments in that space, please?
Only that it's not unusual. If anything, it would be more or additional grant funding. I think they're betting on the fact that the grant funding we've already received is for a 3-year period, and that will be expected to deal with the additional workload through the existing funding, and nothing for ASIA either in that respect. There's no mention of the IGA though, which I would have thought might receive some funding, so we'll have to do some further work out of session on that one.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jen. Mark Kane, Steel Institute, you've got your hand up, but please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Just a question. How much do you think wage growth is affecting the outlook?
Okay, look, I might bring David or Peter in on this point. And I mean, one of the concerns I have here, I was on Sky earlier this morning, just immediately after Michelle O'Neill, and certainly what we're hearing from the unions straight off the back of the budget is that this opens the door to stronger wage growth. There's certainly projections in the budget for real wage increase. So that's one thing. I would have said, if you're serious about trying to take inflationary heat out of the economy, you've got measures, got the repackaging of stage 3 tax cuts. We should be seeking to use that increase in disposable incomes to offset further higher wage claims, certainly wage claims that we're seeing above CPI, which without the productivity. So I'm quite nervous about what we're going to see out of the annual wage review. I think the risk now shifts to the Fair Work Commission with the annual wage review decision next month, and clearly a quite delusional or misguided attitude with the unions here that now is the time to actually press harder in terms of wage claims. So I'm not at all sanguine about that particular outlook. Anything you want to add, David or Peter, on that point?
Sure. I would just say Michelle Bullock only last week said that wages running ahead of productivity would weigh very heavily on their considerations in monetary policy. And we know that productivity levels aren't at a level which would support higher levels of wages. So we are going to have a moment of truth. There's no way around that equation. There's no magic bullet on productivity in the offing. There's no real reforms that are going to generate more productivity. So they're running a high risk strategy there.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're actually forecasting that wages growth has peaked, and they're expecting significant easing in their wages forecasts for 2024-25, down to only 3.25%. But I find it interesting whether, I have doubts, my doubts whether that would be achieved. One of the things that conflicts that they actually had in the budget was that they were saying that the government's measures have been supporting strong wages growth, and they were particularly pointing to the administrative increases in wages associated with the annual wage reviews. So unless there's the Fair Work Commission is likely to back off and have a much smaller increase in the minimum and average annual award wages, as we're asking for in the annual wage review of only about 2%, then it's quite likely that wages pressure will continue for quite a lot longer.
Hey, look, thanks for that. So look, I think we're close to wrapping it up. Just before we do, there's a question or a comment there from Lachlan from BCQ, just around the infrastructure spend. So I'm not sure if Peter, perhaps if you can see that question in the chat. Is there a quick answer to Lachlan, or we can come back to Lachlan on that?
I'll come back to Lachlan on that, but overall, in terms of infrastructure spending, there was very little announced, and it was quite interesting because infrastructure is often a sort of centerpiece of the budget, and they're often announcing significant infrastructure investment, and there is very little additional infrastructure spending in this budget, across all states, not just in Queensland. But I will get back to Lachlan on that as well.
Thank you. And I see a comment there or a question from Daniel Popovsky about, do we think this is an election budget? Look, I'm sure there'll be different views on that and what the strategy might be. I know some people think there is a possibility that we could see an election later this year, and perhaps $300 energy bill relief is part of the strategy to sweeten up a few voters. It wouldn't change my vote, I've got to say, but it wouldn't convince me one way or the other. But I don't know. Personally, looking at this, I wouldn't have said this is a particularly convincing pre-election pitch. Others might disagree, but I'm not sure how we interpret that. So just see, Mark, you've got your hand up. Was that a new point, or that's from the previous point, Mark McKenzie?
Sorry, Andrew, that's an old point. I haven't taken my hand
That's an old point. No problem. No problem at all. Look, okay. Go ahead, David, do you want to say something?
Andrew, I was just going to say, Daniel also asked about the coalition for the budget in reply. It seems that they're shaping up to oppose the production tax credits that have been offered up for mining companies in critical minerals. They've declared it to be billions for billionaires, so I don't think there's going to be walking back from that. They seem to be indicating that the electricity subsidy, $300 payment, should not be going to high earners. Whether that becomes part of their pitch on Thursday night, it's another question. They've been talking in the wake of stage 3 tax cuts. They didn't like that change that Labor made. It would be very expensive to restore the original, and probably would have quite a lot of political costs to it as well, because it would really be a big financial benefit to higher earners. But they do seem to be increasingly talking about bracket creep, and whether they take some step on future indexation of tax scales, I don't know, but their language is kind of circling around that. So there's some of the things.
Great, thanks, Dave. Final point I can see in the chat, defence spend. So Rowan Bodenhop has asked about defence spending. I don't know whether, we've got Chris online. Chris Barnes, are you able to comment on that?
Thanks, Andrew. Apologies, everyone. My camera's not working. The defence issue there really revolves around the capability, and there is a measure there of $100 million looking at over the next 7 years for developing defence industry training and skills, that seems a very modest amount of money for what is an extraordinary project under Pillar 1, which is subs, and Pillar 2, which is all of the other cyber, digital, quantum measures. So it does seem a little underweight. I hope that answers your question, Rowan. I know the Northern Territory is very keen on defence spending.
And of course, we had the major sort of portfolio focus on the defence strategy a few weeks back. I mean, it's fair to say as much as possible of that defence profile was pushed towards the never rather than being in the immediate forward estimates. Chris, I think that's true, is it not?
Correct.
Yeah, and I think if you look in budget paper number 1 as well, in terms of the top areas of growth, there are some growth and expenditure, which defence is always one. I'll just have to go and find that chart, which I haven't got in front of me now, but I know areas like public debt interest, we've seen the growth in that pulling back a little bit of a pullback in areas like NDIS, but still very high or very close to double digit. Defence is in that sort of top 5 or 6. I think there hasn't been a lot of change in terms of the rate of growth in defence in at least in the near term. So, but obviously it is an area where we watch what's going on. Okay, I don't think I see any further hands. So look, maybe we bring the discussion to a conclusion at that point. Can I finish by saying, firstly, appreciate the active engagement across the board from members on the day after the budget. As with every year, this is an incredibly important point in time in assessing the direction of policy, the strategy that government's pursuing, and the ACCI team are very happy to be able to bring as much analysis as we can to help members in digesting the important trends and themes. So we look forward to engaging that discussion further through the various committees over coming days and weeks. The Economics Committee, Workplace Relations, Work Health and Safety, Employment and Skills, and so on. So we look forward to your contributions in those different forums. As a final point, I should just highlight there's a couple of upcoming events that if you are able to look at. So on the 21st, so next week, 21st of May, we're doing a joint event in Sydney, in Parramatta, for those of you who can travel out to Parramatta, but it's so never mind what we've got to say, hear the Treasurer directly. So we're hosting the Treasurer jointly with Business Western Sydney in Parramatta. Details of that event have been circulated in various emails and in our regular weekly member updates. So if you're interested in that, please give us a hoy. I think there's still a few slots available. I note also that next week the Business Chamber in Queensland are directly also hosting the Treasurer. They turn on a great event. So if there's anybody in Brisbane next week, I'll certainly be going up to Brisbane for that. Again, a chance to hear the Treasurer directly. Chance to ask a question of him directly or to hear the Treasurer's perspectives directly. Those are a couple of great events, but I think I just want to highlight those. So otherwise, I think we've covered the agenda. We've had good attendance. So thank you all for your participation, and I'm pleased to close the meeting. Thanks very much.